On a night like this, London hides its darkest secrets. And somewhere in this fog, a killer still walks free.
It has been my frequent observation, during the many years of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most perplexing mysteries often announce themselves not with fanfare, but with the softest whisper of the inexplicable. A child's forgotten toy, a pressed flower between the pages of a ledger, the faintest sound in an empty room. These seemingly insignificant details have time and again proven to be the threads from which my remarkable friend has unraveled the most complex tapestries of human deception. The autumn of 1895 had settled upon London with particular malevolence, wrapping the great metropolis in a shroud of yellow fog so dense that the familiar streets seemed transformed into alien pathways. From our comfortable lodgings at 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps appeared as mere halos of amber light, struggling against the oppressive gloom that seemed to seep through the very mortar of the city's ancient walls. The hiss of the newly charged street lamps created an almost musical accompaniment to the muffled sounds of evening traffic, as if London itself were holding its breath in anticipation of some momentous event. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon in what I had come to recognize as one of his periods of intense mental activity, though to the casual observer, he might have appeared to be doing nothing more than lounging in his armchair before the fire. His long, lean frame was stretched out with the fluid grace of a resting predator, his keen grey eyes half closed in contemplation, and his pipe sending lazy spirals of smoke toward the ceiling. The morning papers lay scattered about his feet, their headlines proclaiming the usual catalogue of political scandals and social upheavals that seemed to define our turbulent age. "Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence like a blade through silk, "what would you make of a man who takes great care with his appearance, yet allows his fingernails to remain perpetually stained with some dark substance?" I glanced up from my medical journal, somewhat startled by this unexpected observation. I should think of him as either a tradesman who has recently come into money, or perhaps a gentleman with unusual hobbies, gardening perhaps, or amateur chemistry. "Ah, but you have overlooked the most obvious explanation," Holmes replied, unfolding himself from his chair with that characteristic fluid motion that never failed to remind me of a great cat preparing to spring. Such a man is one who wishes to appear respectable while concealing the true nature of his regular occupation. The careful attention to dress suggests he has both the means and the desire to present himself as a gentleman. Yet the permanently stained fingernails indicate frequent contact with substances that no amount of scrubbing can entirely remove. Coal dust, perhaps, or certain chemical compounds used in less reputable industries. Before I could formulate a response to this typical display of deductive reasoning, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the stairway below, accompanied by Mrs. Hudson's voice, raised in what appeared to be a gentle but firm protest. The steps were heavy and rapid, suggesting both urgency and official authority, a combination that, in my experience, usually heralded the arrival of Scotland Yard. "You have visitors from the Yard," Holmes observed without turning from his examination of his fingernails. "The tread is too measured for a private citizen in distress, yet too hurried for a social call. Inspector Lestrade, unless I am much mistaken, and in considerable haste." Indeed, a moment later our landlady appeared at the door, her usually composed demeanour showing signs of considerable agitation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, smoothing her apron with nervous hands, "Inspector Lestrade is here to see you. He's in quite a state, I'm afraid, and insists the matter cannot wait." Holmes's eyes brightened immediately, with that familiar gleam that appeared whenever the prospect of an interesting case presented itself. "By all means, Mrs. Hudson, show him up. And perhaps you might bring some brandy. From the sound of those footsteps, our visitor may be in need of fortification." The man who entered our sitting room confirmed Holmes's deduction in every particular. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood before us, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a hurried journey through the fog-shrouded streets. His bowler hat was slightly askew, his greatcoat was dusted with the fine soot that characterized London's more neglected quarters, and his sharp features bore an expression of mingled frustration and bewilderment that I had rarely seen in the capable inspector. Before Lestrade could speak, Holmes subjected him to that swift, comprehensive glance that so often made a man feel as though his very soul had been catalogued and filed away for future reference. "You have come from Bloomsbury," Holmes observed casually, settling back into his chair, "and in considerable haste. The particular shade of clay upon your right boot is found only in the gardens near Russell Square, while the soot upon your coat suggests you have recently been in one of those narrow lanes where the chimney sweeps have been particularly active. You have also, I observe, recently washed your hands with the coarse soap provided in public houses. There are still traces of it beneath your fingernails. I deduce, therefore, that you have been investigating a matter in one of the quieter residential areas near the British Museum, and that the investigation has proven sufficiently frustrating to drive you to seek liquid consolation before coming to consult me." Lestrade's eyes, which had begun darting about the room with barely contained impatience, settled into that expression of grudging admiration that Holmes's deductions invariably produced in the practical inspector. "Bloomsbury it is, Mr. Holmes," he said with a short laugh that held little humor, "and Marigold Lane specifically. As for the rest, well, you're near enough to make a man wonder if you've been following me through the fog." He accepted the chair Holmes indicated and the glass of brandy Mrs. Hudson provided with obvious gratitude. "I've come because we have a case that defies every principle of rational investigation, and if the newspapers get hold of it before we can provide some reasonable explanation, Scotland Yard will be the laughingstock of London." Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded the inspector with that patient attention he reserved for the most promising puzzles. "Pray proceed, Lestrade. I find that cases which appear to defy rational explanation are often the most rewarding to the properly trained mind." Lestrade took a steadying sip of brandy before continuing. 3 nights ago, the residents of Marigold Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac near the British Museum, began reporting a most unusual phenomenon. They claimed to hear whispers, Mr. Holmes, not the ordinary whispers of neighbors gossiping over garden walls, but voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls of their homes. The words were indistinct, but the effect was unmistakable. A low, sibilant murmuring that occurred precisely at the stroke of midnight and continued for exactly 1 hour. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "And the content of these whispers? According to the witnesses, the voices spoke of secrets, of things hidden and things remembered. Old Mrs. Hartwell at number 3 swears she heard her late husband's voice, warning her about the yellow wax. Young Timothy Fletcher at number 9 claims the whispers knew details about his father's business dealings that no living soul should possess." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yellow wax, you say? An oddly specific detail. Please continue." On the second night, the whispers were accompanied by physical evidence. Several residents found notes pushed beneath their doors, thin foreign paper sealed with wax of a peculiar yellow color, like that of marigold petals. Each note contained only a single word: hush. The inspector reached into his coat and produced a small envelope, which he handled with obvious care. "This is one of the notes, Mr. Holmes. We've examined it thoroughly. But the paper appears to be of Indian manufacture, and the wax contains no identifying characteristics save its unusual color." Holmes accepted the envelope but did not immediately open it, instead holding it up to the lamplight and examining it from various angles. "Most intriguing. And the third night?" Lestrade's expression grew even more grave. "The third night brought tragedy, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Percival Quinton, a retired map engraver who lived alone at number 7, was found dead in his locked study. There were no signs of violence, no indication of forced entry, and the divisional surgeon could find no obvious cause of death. Yet his face bore an expression of such terror that it would haunt the dreams of anyone who saw it. A locked room, you say? Locked from the inside with the key still in place. The windows were latched, the chimney too narrow for human passage, and the walls solid brick. Yet somehow the whispers had reached him there, for we found evidence of their visitation. From his pocket, Lestrade produced 2 additional items: a dried marigold flower, its orange petals now faded to a dull brown, and a small tin humming top painted with floral designs. The flower was found pressed between the pages of Mr. Quinton's personal diary, and the top was discovered beneath his chair. When spun, the top produces a sound remarkably similar to the whispers described by the other residents. Holmes accepted both items and examined them with his magnifying glass. his keen eyes noting details that would escape ordinary observation. After several minutes of silent study, he looked up with that slight smile that indicated his mind had begun to perceive patterns invisible to others. Most illuminating, Inspector. Tell me, what do you know of the other residents of Marigold Lane? Any individuals with particular expertise in acoustics, perhaps, or with knowledge of the East Indies? There is one resident who bears watching, Lestrade replied. A Mr. Elias Vetch, who occupies number 5. He styles himself a mesmerist and spiritualist, conducting séances and other such nonsense for credulous clients. He and Mr. Quinton had words recently over some matter, and there are witnesses to what might be construed as a threat. Ah, the convenient villain, Holmes observed with a slight smile. How refreshingly traditional. Nevertheless, we must not allow prejudice to cloud our judgment. The facts, as you have presented them, suggest a mind of considerable ingenuity at work, one that understands both the psychology of fear and the practical mechanics of creating seemingly supernatural phenomena. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. Watson, you perceive the essential elements of our puzzle. Whispers that seem to come from nowhere, knowledge that should be impossible to obtain, and a death that appears to have no earthly cause. Yet I suspect that when we examine the scene more closely, we shall find that the supernatural has once again yielded to the merely ingenious. Turning back to Lestrade, Holmes's eyes held that gleam of anticipation that I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases. Inspector, I believe a visit to Marigold Lane is in order. The fog may conceal many things, but it cannot hide the truth from eyes that know how to look for it. As we prepared to venture into the murky London night, Holmes paused to spin the little humming top upon our table. It whirled with a low, droning note that was indeed remarkably similar to the sound of distant whispering, until it wobbled and fell silent. "Do you hear, Watson?" he said with that sudden, almost boyish enthusiasm that sometimes seized him when a particularly intriguing puzzle presented itself. Even children's toys can speak volumes to those who listen properly. Come, let us discover what secrets the houses of Marigold Lane are so eager to whisper. The game, as my friend would say, was afoot. The fog received us like a living shroud as our hansom cab groped its way through the labyrinthine streets toward Bloomsbury. Our driver, hunched upon his perch like some creature of the mist, called out occasional warnings to the phantom pedestrians who materialized and vanished again in the yellow gloom. The familiar landmarks of London had been transformed into alien shapes, and the very air seemed thick enough to cut with a blade. Holmes sat beside me in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the sickly glow of a passing gas lamp. Only once during our tortuous journey did he break his reverie, when a lamplighter working beneath a flickering street lamp caught his attention. "Note, Watson," he murmured, tapping the window. "The man's shin bears a strip of clean cloth, yet there is no stiffness in his gait. A recent injury from a carriage step, I would venture, suggesting he supplements his regular rounds with paid errands for the neighboring houses. Observe the calling cards protruding. From his coat, a man will tell you his circumstances. If you learn to read the fog upon him..." Marigold Lane proved to be a narrow cul-de-sac, paved with old cobbles that gleamed like the backs of wet beetles in the lamplight. The dozen houses faced one another with that prim, reproachful air that certain respectable streets contrive to adopt, as if the very bricks held court over the morals of their inhabitants. A constable stood before number 7, his cape beaded with moisture, while from within came the faint creak of boards and subdued murmur of voices. The lane itself seemed to hold its breath. So profound was the silence that even the soft padding of a cat sounded conspicuous. Yet there was something else in the atmosphere, a tremor, as if the very place remembered the whispers and had not yet recovered from them. Lestrade guided us through Quinton's narrow hall, which bore the scent of sealing wax and stale tobacco. "We have kept the room precisely as we found it, Mr. Holmes, save for the removal of the body," he explained. Quinton was a man of methodical habits, ate at 7:30, walked the lane at 9, retired to his study at 10. The neighbors heard his chair scrape as the clock struck midnight. At 1 he was dead. The study bore the character of its owner as plainly as a portrait. A long table near the window displayed plates of copper and steel in orderly stacks, alongside a loupe, a graver, and delicate calipers resting upon a leather pad. Against one wall stood a cabinet of maps with drawers labelled in neat script, Channel, Levant, Bombay. A small iron safe squatted in the corner, while the hearth contained only fine grey ghosts of old ash. Holmes's examination began with his characteristic, methodical precision. He neither hurried nor lingered, allowing his keen gaze to play over each object, with the delicate touch of a violin bow finding the true note. He paused at the door, then at the keyhole, kneeling to examine it closely before drawing out his handkerchief and touching it delicately to the inner edge. The merest smear of colour marked the linen, which he folded away without comment. At the window he flicked a fingernail against the latch, producing the smallest chirr. "The sash is not as innocent as it would pretend, Watson. No dust upon the inner lip where there ought to be, and a scratch not a week old upon the paint. Did your men try the window, Lestrade?" he inquired. "We did not," the inspector replied promptly. "We were particular to examine without disturbing." "Commendable. Then the scratch belongs to our visitor." Holmes's tone carried that odd lightness that always heralded some internal calculation. "And yet it does not indicate what you may suppose." He produced the humming top from his pocket and spun it upon the desk. Its low droning vibrated against the window panes and seemed by some acoustic trick to circle the room. One can make a whisper of any sustained tone if the ear is properly deceived. A vent here, a hollow there, a cornice that carries sound. Quinton's study is as resonant as a violin case. Turning to the desk, Holmes examined the open diary beneath the pressed marigold. "Our Mr. Quinton writes with unusual neatness for a tradesman," he observed, reading silently. "And he writes of money. E.V. called, demanded £5 upon old plates, refused. Mentioned the yellow again. E.V. Lestrade?" "Elias Vetch of number 5, the inspector replied with satisfaction. "The mesmerist who had words with the deceased. Kept the whole lane awake last night with his séance nonsense." Before we could investigate further, a door opened at number 3, and an elderly woman emerged wrapped in a thick woolen shawl. Mrs. Hartwell moved with careful steps, her eyes darting nervously about the fog-shrouded lane. "Inspector Lestrade," she called in a trembling voice. The whispers came again last night, clearer than ever. They spoke of my dear departed Herbert, things I've never told another living soul. Holmes approached with characteristic courtesy. "Mrs. Hartwell, I am Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Lestrade has asked us to assist in this matter. The whispers you heard, can you recall the exact words?" Her eyes widened with recognition. "Mr. Holmes," they said, "mind the yellow wax, just as my Alfred used to warn me about the candles. And the very next day I found this beneath my door." She produced a thin envelope sealed with peculiar yellow wax. Holmes examined the seal briefly before bowing over her hand. "You shall have this returned by day's end, madam." "You have my word." As we prepared to leave, Holmes stood very still in the study's doorway, and I fancied that wheels were beginning to turn within that extraordinary mind. "Inspector," he said finally, "if you can place a man at number 7's window between midnight and 1, or at any letterbox or upon the rooftops, you will have done your part. Watson and I shall return at 11. I have a fancy to hear the lane speak for itself. The game, as my friend would say, was indeed afoot." We returned to Marigold Lane as the church bells struck 11. Finding the fog had lifted somewhat to reveal the narrow cul-de-sac in all its Georgian propriety. The gas lamps burned steadier now, casting pools of amber light that transformed the wet cobbles into a checkerboard of shadow and gleam. Holmes moved with that peculiar silent grace that marked his most intense investigations, while I followed with my medical bag and a small dark lantern, conscious of every footfall upon the ancient stones. Lestrade had positioned his constables as instructed, their presence felt rather than seen in the peripheral darkness. Holmes began not with Quinton's house, but with a systematic examination of the lane's physical characteristics. He knelt at the base of the central lamppost, running his gloved fingers over the iron base where a faint, oily residue caught the light. "Someone has been quite industrious here." "Watson," he murmured, producing a small vial of testing powder from his waistcoat. A few grains scattered upon the substance glowed briefly green in the lamplight. Wax mixed with lamp oil, a curious combination for legitimate purposes. Moving to the narrow passage between numbers 5 and 6, Holmes examined the ironwork gate with his magnifying glass. "The rust has been disturbed recently. Note the bright metal beneath. And here, he pointed to a fragment of dark, brittle material caught in the gate's hinge. Lichen, Watson, but not the variety that grows in London gardens. This species thrives only in damp, shaded environments, typically on old stone that sees little sunlight. At number 7, Holmes spent considerable time examining the ground beneath Quinton's study window. In the soft earth, barely visible even to my trained eye, lay a faint circular impression no larger than a crown piece. Pressure, not impact, Holmes observed, carefully measuring the indentation with his pocket rule. Something was placed here deliberately and removed with equal care. Our investigation was interrupted by the appearance of Mr. Elias Vetch, who emerged from number 5 with theatrical timing. He was a lean, olive-skinned man of perhaps 35 years, with lustrous dark hair and a pointed beard that lent him an almost satanic aspect. The scent of some oriental perfume clung to his person, and his long fingers bore traces of a pale, waxy residue. "Inspector Lestrade spoke of your arrival, Mr. Holmes," Vetch said with elaborate courtesy. "I trust you will find our little mystery stimulating. The veil between worlds grows thin in certain places at certain hours." Holmes regarded him with detached interest. "Indeed, Mr. Vetch. I observe you work with materials requiring delicate handling. The residue beneath your fingernails suggests wax or perhaps paraffin." Vetch's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. "I conduct seances, Mr. Holmes. Candles are essential to create the proper atmosphere for spiritual communication." Before Holmes could respond, young Timothy Fletcher appeared from number 9, his face bright with curiosity. "The whispers speak of father's business, sir," he confided to me in an urgent whisper. "Things about the paper from Bombay and the yellow seals. But I never told anyone those secrets. Your father imports paper, does he not?" Holmes asked absently, his attention focused on the rain pipe that ran down number 7's wall. "Yes, sir. Thin paper from India, fine as silk. Father says it's worth more than gold for certain purposes." Holmes's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. At the base of the drainpipe, nearly invisible against the dark iron, a gossamer thread caught the lamplight. With infinite care, he extracted a filament no thicker than spider's silk and held it up to the gas lamp. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Not silk, Watson, but something that aspires to be silk." As midnight approached, Holmes positioned us strategically throughout the lane. He took his place near the lamppost, while I stationed myself at Mrs. Hartwell's door, where the elderly woman waited in trembling anticipation. When the clock struck 12, the lane seemed to exhale. A low susurration rose from the very stones, resolving into sibilant whispers that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. "Mind the yellow wax," breathed a voice near my ear. "The old plates remember," sighed another. Mrs. Hartwell clutched my arm as the floorboards creaked without cause. Holmes stood motionless by the lamppost, his keen eyes tracking something invisible to the rest of us. At precisely 1 o'clock he raised his hand in a sharp gesture, and the whispers ceased as if severed by a blade. "Lestrade," he called softly, "examine the lamp fitter's ladder. You will find it has been used for purposes other than lighting gas." He turned to Vetch, who stood pale in his doorway. "Mr. Vetch, your seances may continue, but I suggest you confine them to more conventional methods. The dead, I find, rarely require such elaborate mechanical assistance to make their voices heard." As we prepared to leave, Holmes lingered at the lamppost base, where he carefully extracted another gossamer filament from a nearly invisible crack in the ironwork. "The lane has indeed spoken, Watson," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Tomorrow, I believe, we shall discover that some whispers are far more substantial than they appear." The morning found Holmes in his element, hunched over his chemical apparatus, with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. The sitting room had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory, with various reagents and testing solutions arranged in precise order across our table. The gossamer filaments from Marigold Lane lay mounted on glass slides, while samples of the peculiar yellow wax rested in small porcelain dishes, awaiting analysis. "Fascinating, Watson," Holmes murmured without looking up from his microscope. "This thread is indeed silk, but treated with a preparation I have rarely encountered. The coating contains lamp oil and paraffin, certainly, but also traces of a resinous substance that speaks of distant shores, possibly Indian in origin." Before I could inquire further, The familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade's boots echoed up our stairs, accompanied by what sounded distinctly like the clanking of metal objects. The inspector entered, bearing a canvas satchel, and wearing an expression of barely contained triumph that transformed his usually sharp features into something approaching boyish excitement. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he announced, setting his burden upon our table with evident satisfaction, "I believe we have made considerable progress in unraveling the mystery of Marigold Lane. Our search of Mr. Vetch's premises has yielded results that would satisfy even the most skeptical magistrate." From his satchel, Lestrade produced a leather-bound ledger, several sheets of the thin Indian paper we had observed, and what appeared to be a collection of small brass instruments. "Vetch's private accounts, gentlemen. Among his various expenditures for what he terms spiritualistic paraphernalia, we find entries for specialized wax of a peculiar yellow hue, Indian paper of the finest grade, and various musical instruments designed to produce resonant tones." Holmes accepted the ledger and began turning its pages with the delicate touch of a bibliophile handling a rare manuscript. His keen eyes scanned the neat entries, while his expression remained characteristically unreadable. "Most methodical of Mr. Vetch to maintain such detailed records of his alleged criminal activities," he observed with that dry tone that invariably preceded his more devastating deductions. "There's more," Lestrade continued, producing a sealed envelope from his coat. "This letter was found among Quinton's correspondence, dated 3 weeks past. It bears Vetch's signature and speaks quite plainly of the deceased's unpaid obligations regarding certain engravings. The tone grows increasingly threatening, culminating in a promise to unleash forces beyond mortal comprehension should payment not be forthcoming." I felt the familiar satisfaction that accompanies the resolution of a complex puzzle. Here was motive, means, and opportunity presented with crystalline clarity. Vetch, with his theatrical profession and dubious moral character, had clearly orchestrated the supernatural phenomena to extort money from the unfortunate Quinton, whose sensitive nerves had proven unequal to the strain. Holmes, however, closed the ledger with an almost gentle motion and regarded Lestrade with that peculiar smile that suggested his mind was operating on an entirely different plane from our own. "Tell me, Inspector, during your search of Mr. Vetch's premises, did you discover any specimens of lichen, particularly the delicate variety that grows only on ancient, undisturbed stone?" Lestrade's triumphant expression faltered slightly. "Lichen? No, Mr. Holmes. Should we have expected to find such a thing?" "Perhaps not," Holmes replied, moving to the window where the morning light provided better illumination for his examination of the yellow wax sample. "Yet I found traces of precisely such lichen caught in the ironwork gate between numbers 5 and 6. A curious variety that thrives only in environments of perpetual dampness and shadow, old churchyards, forgotten cellars, places where time itself seems to have grown moss." He held the wax sample up to the light, studying it through his magnifying glass. "Moreover, this wax, while certainly yellow, contains traces of pollen from a plant that does not bloom in autumn, and certainly not within the confines of any London dwelling. The composition suggests a more exotic origin than Mr. Vetch's candle-making supplies would provide." At this moment, our discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the street below. Through the window we observed young Timothy Fletcher approaching our door with the urgent gait of one bearing important news. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in gentle protest, but Holmes gestured for the boy to be admitted. "Please." "Sir?" Timothy gasped as he entered, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I know Father forbade me to speak of it, but the Whispers, they knew things about his business that no stranger should know. They spoke of special papers from Bombay, of government seals, of maps that mustn't be seen by unfriendly eyes." Holmes's attention sharpened immediately. "Government work, you say? Your father provides materials for official documents." "Yes, sir, though he's always been particularly secretive about it. Says some papers are too important for ordinary folk to handle. Mr. Quinton was one of his special customers, always paid extra for the finest Indian stock and the yellow sealing wax that comes from the East." The implications were becoming clearer yet more complex. If Quinton had been involved in government work requiring special materials and secrecy, the Whisper's uncanny knowledge suggested something far more sophisticated than a simple extortion scheme. There is another matter, Holmes said, turning back to Lestrade. The lamplighter Thomas Dilly mentioned lending his ladder to a gentleman with a schoolmaster's voice, someone taller and broader than Mr. Vetch. This mysterious figure had the knowledge and opportunity to install whatever mechanism produced our whispers, yet he remains entirely absent from your convenient case against the mesmerist. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps Vetch hired an accomplice or disguised his voice. Perhaps, Holmes interrupted gently. We are meant to believe exactly what the evidence so obligingly suggests. Consider, Inspector. A man planning to commit fraud through supernatural deception maintains detailed written records of his purchases, leaves threatening letters in his victim's possession, and arranges for all the physical evidence to point directly to his door. Either Mr. Vetch is the most incompetent criminal in London, or someone has taken considerable care to ensure that he appears guilty. As if summoned by our discussion, a knock sounded at our door, and Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Mr. Fletcher himself. The stationer entered with obvious reluctance, his prosperous appearance somewhat diminished by an air of nervous agitation that no amount of careful grooming could entirely conceal. "Gentlemen," he began, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, "I come because my conscience will not permit silence. These whispers that have terrorized our lane, they speak of matters that should remain buried. If that charlatan Vetch is responsible, I demand he be brought to justice immediately." Holmes regarded him with interest. "You seem remarkably certain of Mr. Vetch's guilt, Mr. Fletcher. Have you evidence beyond what Inspector Lestrade has already gathered?" Fletcher's colour deepened. "I know his type, sir. These foreigners with their mysterious ways, preying upon honest English folk with their heathen practices. The sooner he's removed from respectable society, the better for all concerned." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And your business relationship with the late Mr. Quinton, was it entirely satisfactory?" "Quinton was a difficult man," Fletcher replied stiffly, "particularly about his materials, slow to pay his accounts. We had our differences, but I am a man of business, not a murderer." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Quite so. Tell me, Mr. Fletcher, in your professional capacity, have you encountered many individuals requiring the specialized papers and sealing materials that young Timothy mentioned?" Fletcher's eyes darted nervously between us. "My client relationships are confidential, sir. I provide materials. I do not inquire into their use." "Admirable discretion," Holmes observed. "We shall not detain you further." After Fletcher's hasty departure, Holmes turned to us with that expression of quiet satisfaction that indicated his mental machinery had achieved some crucial alignment. "Gentlemen, we have before us a case that presents itself with almost insulting simplicity, yet conceals complexities that extend far beyond the narrow confines of Marigold Lane. Mr. Vetch may indeed be guilty of many things, but I suspect the whispers that terrified our victims were the work of a more sophisticated mind, one that understands not only the mechanics of deception, but the psychology of misdirection. The game, as my friend would say, was growing more intriguing by the hour. The morning found Holmes in a state of intense concentration that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most brilliant deductions. While Inspector Lestrade busied himself with preparing formal charges against Elias Vetch, my friend had transformed our sitting room into a makeshift laboratory, subjecting the various artifacts from Marigold Lane to rigorous scientific analysis. The yellow wax sample lay mounted beneath his microscope, while various chemical reagents stood ready in their precise array. Holmes worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, each test designed to reveal secrets that casual observation might miss. The familiar scratch of his pen filled the silence as he recorded his findings in that cramped handwriting that only I had learned to decipher. "Fascinating. Watson," he murmured without looking up from his apparatus. "This wax is far more sophisticated than any common sealing material. Note the aroma when heated, not the familiar scent of beeswax or paraffin, but something distinctly floral, with an underlying sharpness that speaks of Eastern origins." He added a drop of testing solution to the heated sample, and instead of dissolving as ordinary wax would, the substance coagulated into a resilient bead that maintained its integrity despite the chemical assault. "Most remarkable," Holmes continued, adjusting his microscope with delicate precision. The pollen embedded within this wax is not from any indigenous London flora, nor even from the common marigold that gives our lane its name. This is from Tagetes patula, a variety cultivated primarily in the hotter regions of the Indian subcontinent for its distinctive pigment and resinous properties. Such material is both rare and expensive, hardly the stock of a Bloomsbury spiritualist. The gossamer silk thread received similar scrutiny, revealing a tensile strength and resinous coating that spoke of specialized preparation. Holmes consulted one of his botanical references, tracing entries with his long finger until he found the confirmation he sought. The same resin, Watson. This thread has been treated with materials that would cost more than Vetch earns in a month of seances. We are dealing with someone who has access to the most specialized imports from the East, someone with resources far beyond those of our convenient suspect. Lestrade's arrival interrupted these investigations, the inspector bearing news that he clearly considered the final nail in Vetch's coffin. The magistrate has signed the warrant, Mr. Holmes. We have testimony from 3 neighbors about the threatening letter, and the evidence from his lodgings speaks for itself. Holmes set down his magnifying glass and regarded Lestrade with that patient expression he reserved for well-meaning but misguided colleagues. Tell me, Inspector, during your thorough search of Mr. Vetch's premises, did you discover any specimens of rare botanical materials, specifically the type of exotic pollen I have just identified in this wax sample? Lestrade's confident expression wavered slightly. Pollen? No, Mr. Holmes. Should we have expected such a thing? Perhaps not, Holmes replied, moving to examine the silk thread under better light. Yet this evidence suggests our mysterious orchestrator has access to materials that would require direct importation from specialized dealers in Oriental goods. The sophistication of these preparations indicates knowledge and resources that extend far beyond the capabilities of a local mesmerist. Before Lestrade could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Dilly, the lamplighter, who had been summoned at Holmes's request. The weathered man entered with obvious nervousness, cap in hand and clearly awed by the scientific apparatus scattered about our sitting room. "You wish to see me again, sir?" Dilly asked, his eyes darting between the chemical equipment and Holmes's intent gaze. "You wish to see me again, sir?" Dilly asked, his eyes darting between the chemical equipment and Holmes's intent gaze. "Indeed, Mr. Dilly, I would like you to describe once more the gentleman who borrowed your ladder. Take your time and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." Dilly shifted his weight and closed his eyes in concentration. "A tall fellow, sir, broader in the shoulder than Mr. Vetch. Spoke like a schoolmaster, proper vowels and a way of speaking soft-like, as if he was used to being listened to. Dark coat that smelt faint of varnish, and hands that were clean but strong. Paid me the shilling without haggling, which marked him as a gentleman." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And his manner? Was he familiar with the lane's layout?" "Aye, sir. Knew exactly which lamp he wanted and where to place the ladder. Worked quick and neat, like a man who'd planned it all beforehand." After Dilly's departure, Holmes stood motionless by our window, his keen eyes focused on some internal calculation. The evidence before us painted a picture that grew more complex with each revelation. Materials too expensive for Vetch to afford, knowledge too specialized for a simple fraud, and a mysterious figure whose very existence contradicted the convenient case against the mesmerist. "Watson," Holmes said finally. Turning from the window with that gleam of anticipation, I had learned to associate with his most challenging puzzles. "We have been presented with a case that appears to solve itself with insulting simplicity, yet conceals complexities that extend far beyond the narrow confines of Marigold Lane." He gestured toward the array of evidence spread across our table. The whispers, the exotic materials, the sophisticated timing, all of it points to a mind of considerable intelligence and resources. Mr. Vetch may indeed be guilty of many things, but I suspect the true architect of these events remains hidden in the shadows, content to let a convenient scapegoat bear the consequences of his elaborate design. The secret clue Holmes had discovered was not a single piece of evidence, but rather the subtle discord between the obvious and the truly significant. Someone had taken extraordinary care to ensure that all evidence pointed directly to Vetch, yet had employed materials and methods that spoke of capabilities far beyond those of their chosen victim. As Lestrade departed to execute his warrant, Holmes remained at our window, his expression thoughtful. "The game grows more intriguing by the hour, Watson. Tomorrow, I believe, we shall discover that some whispers carry more weight than others, and that the most dangerous truths are often hidden behind the most convenient lies." The arrest of Elias Vetch proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked Inspector Lestrade's finest moments. Yet Holmes observed the proceedings with an air of detached skepticism that troubled me considerably. As the mesmerist was led away in handcuffs, protesting his innocence with theatrical dignity, my friend stood at Quinton's study window, with the stillness of a predator, sensing that the true quarry remained at large. "Note, Watson," Holmes murmured as the constables disappeared into the fog, "how readily our suspect accepts his fate. No protestations of alibis, no demands for witnesses. Either he possesses the stoic resignation of the truly innocent, or he knows something that makes resistance futile." The morning brought revelations that shattered Lestrade's convenient solution with devastating efficiency. A telegram arrived from the Criterion Hotel, confirming that Vetch had conducted a séance in their private dining room from 11 until well past 1 o'clock on the crucial night. 6 witnesses, all respectable members of the Psychical Research Society, swore he never left their sight during the entire evening. Moreover, the chemist who had sold him yellow wax confirmed that Vetch had purchased only a single stick 3 weeks prior, hardly sufficient for the quantities we had discovered. Holmes received this news with that peculiar satisfaction that marked his vindication of an unpopular theory. "The more obvious the solution, Watson," he observed, settling into his characteristic restless pacing, "the more vigorously one should question its veracity. Lestrade has caught a fish, certainly, but I suspect it is merely a pilot fish, leading us to far more dangerous waters." Our contemplation was interrupted by young Timothy Fletcher, who appeared with news that sent a chill through the morning air. Another note had been discovered, pushed beneath their door despite Vetch's incarceration. The familiar yellow seal bore the same exotic composition, yet the message within contained only a single, ominous word, "Next." Before we could fully absorb the implications of this development, Mr. Fletcher himself arrived with intelligence that cast our investigation in an entirely new light. His usual careful composure showed signs of considerable strain as he revealed the true nature of his business relationship with the deceased. "Gentlemen," he began reluctantly, "Quinton's work extended far beyond simple map engraving. He possessed plates for reproducing government seals and watermarks, colonial survey maps, shipping manifests, customs documents. Materials that would be worth a considerable fortune to foreign interests, particularly those concerning our eastern territories." Holmes's eyes sharpened immediately. "Government work requiring the specialized Indian paper and exotic sealing wax you provided?" Fletcher's color deepened. "There was one other customer who required such expensive materials, a gentleman who paid premium prices and asked no questions about their ultimate use. But I cannot reveal his identity without compromising my business entirely." As evening approached, Holmes insisted we return to Marigold Lane for what he termed atmospheric observation. The fog had gathered once more, transforming the narrow cul-de-sac into a stage set for whatever drama our unknown adversary had prepared. At precisely midnight, the whispers returned with renewed clarity, their sibilant voices carrying knowledge that no earthly eavesdropper should possess. "The old plates, remember," murmured the darkness near Quinton's window. "Yellow, wax and government seals," breathed, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very bricks. "Not yet finished," sighed the air itself. "More secrets to uncover." Holmes stood motionless by the central lamppost, his keen gaze fixed not on any door or window, but on the void between shadows where something moved with purposeful stealth. At 1 o'clock precisely, the whispers ceased with a dying tremor, followed immediately by the crash of splintering wood from number 7. We rushed to Quinton's study to find the window standing ajar and the iron safe gaping open like a wound. The government maps lay scattered across the floor, but the drawer labeled Channel Survey Confidential had been completely emptied. Upon the safe slip, a smear of yellow wax caught the gaslight like a malignant signature, while a single marigold petal rested on the blotting pad with ceremonial precision. "Gone," breathed Lestrade, his face reddening with embarrassment. taken under our very noses while we had the villain safely in custody. Holmes crouched before the violated safe, his nostrils dilating as if scent might reveal what sight could not. "River sand," he announced, examining fine grit at the baseboard. "Clean with a whisper of mica. Not Thames embankment, too muddy. Canal, perhaps." Our thief required no Jimmy Lestrade. This was opened by hands that knew its secrets. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the study threshold, his expression grave. "Watson, we are no longer dealing with simple fraud or even sophisticated extortion. Someone has been using psychological terror to mask a far more serious crime: the theft of sensitive government documents that could compromise our colonial interests." The whispers were never about supernatural revenge. They were about creating the perfect cover for espionage. The following morning brought the final, chilling confirmation of Holmes's deductions. Mrs. Hudson entered our sitting room with an obvious alarm, bearing a small envelope that had been pushed beneath our door during the night. The familiar yellow seal bore the same exotic composition, but the message within was addressed directly to Holmes in that neat, schoolmasterly hand we had begun to recognize. "Your turn to listen. Mr. Holmes, the game has only just begun." As my friend examined the threatening note with that gleam of anticipation I had learned to associate with his most dangerous cases, I realized that we had moved far beyond the comfortable confines of Marigold Lane into a game whose stakes extended to the very security of the empire itself. The threatening note bearing the colonial office watermark transformed Holmes from contemplative analyst into a creature of focused intensity. He examined the paper with his magnifying glass, noting details that would escape ordinary observation, before setting it carefully upon our table with the reverence one might accord a declaration of war. "Most instructive, Watson," he murmured, his keen eyes bright with that peculiar fire that marked his most dangerous moods. "Our adversary grows bold enough to taunt us, yet careless enough to reveal his hand. This paper is restricted to government officials and their authorized agents. We are no longer pursuing a common criminal, but someone with access to the highest levels of state correspondence." Holmes's response was characteristically unconventional. Rather than rushing to Scotland Yard, he spent the morning in careful preparation, emerging from his bedroom transformed into a shabby clerk with ink-stained fingers, and the stooped posture of one accustomed to long hours bent over ledgers. His destination, he informed me, was the network of government suppliers who operated from the maze of offices near Whitehall. While Holmes pursued his investigations, I remained at Baker Street to receive what proved to be a most illuminating visitor. Mr. Reginald Ashworth arrived precisely at noon, announcing himself as a senior clerk from the Colonial Survey Department. He was impeccably dressed, with the pale complexion and soft hands that spoke of indoor work and comfortable circumstances, yet his manner betrayed considerable nervousness. "Dr. Watson," he began, producing a leather portfolio, "certain irregularities in our map distribution records may bear upon the recent tragedy. Mr. Quinton was one of our authorized engravers, entrusted with reproducing sensitive survey materials that detailed harbor depths, military installations, and shipping routes throughout our eastern territories. The portfolio contained correspondence that cast our case in an entirely new light. Quinton's final letter, dated merely a week before his death, had expressed growing concern about unauthorized inquiries regarding his work. Someone has been asking detailed questions about the Channel survey plates. I fear our security may be compromised." When Holmes returned from his morning's reconnaissance, still maintaining his clerk's disguise, his eyes held the gleam of significant discovery. He listened to Ashworth's account with that patient attention he reserved for crucial intelligence, occasionally interjecting questions that revealed the depth of his understanding. "Your Colonel Weatherby," Holmes said finally. "Describe his physical appearance and manner of speech." "A tall gentleman, broad in the shoulders, with a voice like a schoolmaster, most particular about details, and possessing considerable knowledge regarding Eastern territories. 3 weeks ago, he requested duplicate sets of the Channel survey maps, claiming they were needed for confidential Admiralty review." Holmes's eyes met mine across the room, and I saw in them the gleam of recognition. The mysterious figure who had borrowed the lamplighter's ladder was acquiring both substance and motive. After Ashworth's departure, Holmes shed his disguise and began pacing our sitting room with that restless energy that marked his most intense calculations. "Watson," he announced, "we are confronting espionage disguised as supernatural phenomena." The whispers were psychological warfare, designed to extract information while deflecting suspicion. Our next destination became clear when Holmes recalled my observation about the river sand with mica traces found in Quinton's study. "Not Thames mud, Watson, but canal sediment. Our adversary maintains a base near water, somewhere barges unload specialized materials. The Regent's Canal proved to be our quarry's hunting ground. We walked the towpaths for nearly an hour, past silent barges and derelict warehouses, before Holmes paused at a section where an old stone bridge arched over the murky water. He knelt examining the ancient foundations with minute attention. "Here, Watson," he said, pointing to luxuriant lichen growth, "the very specimen we found at Marigold Lane. And observe," he indicated faint indentations in the damp earth near the water's edge, the impression of a small boat, recently moored. A rhythmic tapping sound echoed from within a nearby derelict warehouse, too precise for casual repair work, too deliberate for random noise. Holmes approached the building with characteristic stealth, peering through a crack in the boarded windows before returning with eyes bright with triumph. "Our schoolmaster is industrious, Watson," he whispered. Within, I observed a formidable man presiding over a printing press, assisted by a smaller fellow with ink-stained hands. They are reproducing Quinton's survey maps with meticulous precision, using the very materials that gave our mystery its exotic character. The yellow wax, the Indian paper, the specialized knowledge, all were elements of an elaborate forgery operation designed to produce documents indistinguishable from government originals. The whispers had been both psychological torture and intelligence gathering, inducing victims to reveal secrets that made the forgeries utterly convincing. Holmes began his preparations with methodical precision. From his pocket, he produced a small vial of luminous powder, barium sulfide that would glow upon contact with human skin. "So we shall mark our quarry, Watson, with a ghost's handshake that will burn in his flesh for hours." As evening approached, Holmes positioned us strategically around the warehouse. "Tonight," he announced, loading his revolver, "we discover whether the whispers of Marigold Lane have finished speaking or whether they have one final secret to reveal. Our adversary has grown bold in his success, but I suspect his very boldness will prove his undoing. The game, as my friend would say, was approaching its most critical and dangerous phase. The fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the canal in all its industrial melancholy as Holmes and I took our positions around the derelict warehouse. The rhythmic clacking of the printing press within had resumed after a brief silence, accompanied now by the low murmur of voices engaged in urgent consultation. Through the grimy windows, lamplight flickered with the steady patience of men accustomed to clandestine work. Holmes had positioned us with characteristic precision, himself near the waterside entrance where escape by boat remained possible, while I covered the narrow alley that led toward the main thoroughfare. Lestrade's constables waited in predetermined positions, invisible in the gathering dusk, but ready to close their net at Holmes's signal. "The barium sulfide." "Watson," Holmes whispered, showing me his gloved hands dusted with a faint luminous powder. "Our mysterious schoolmaster will carry the mark of our handshake for hours, glowing like foxfire in the darkness. No matter how he may attempt to flee, he cannot escape the ghost's touch." At precisely 9 o'clock, the warehouse door opened with careful deliberation. The figure that emerged confirmed every detail of our previous observations. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the measured authority of one accustomed to command. Even in the dim gaslight, his bearing suggested military training, while his careful attention to his surroundings spoke of long experience in covert operations. "Mr. Reginald Ashworth," Holmes called softly, stepping from the shadows with that fluid grace that never failed to remind me of a predator in motion, though I suspect that name serves merely as convenient camouflage for your true identity. The man turned with reflexes that confirmed his professional background, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket. In the gaslight, his features revealed themselves as those of a man perhaps 40 years of age, with the weathered complexion of one who had served in distant climates and the calculating eyes of a career intelligence officer. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he replied in that cultured, schoolmasterly voice we had heard described. Your reputation for persistence precedes you, though I fear your timing proves somewhat inconvenient. Behind him, a smaller figure, the Swiss forger Heinrich Steiner, as we later learned, attempted to flee toward the canal with a leather satchel clutched against his chest. The bag split as he stumbled, spilling perfect reproductions of Admiralty charts across the muddy ground, their yellow wax seals glinting like malevolent eyes in the lamplight. The whispers were ingenious, Holmes continued, his tone conversational despite the obvious tension. A network of speaking tubes, concealed within the warehouse's structure, connected to carefully positioned outlets throughout Marigold Lane. Victorian engineering applied to ancient purposes, the very walls became your voice, carrying psychological terror directly into your victims' homes. Ashworth's eyes glittered with what might have been professional admiration. The old map engraver proved surprisingly resilient to conventional interrogation methods. The supernatural approach proved more artistic and considerably more effective in extracting the precise specifications needed for our work. Specifications for government seals, watermark details, even the exact composition of official inks, Holmes observed, producing his revolver as Ashworth's hand moved closer to his weapon. Poor Quinton's terror provided everything necessary to create forgeries indistinguishable from the originals. The confrontation might have continued, but Holmes was prepared for such eventualities. From his coat, he produced a small whistle that emitted a piercing note when blown. Immediately, the sound of running feet echoed from multiple directions as Lestrade's constables converged upon our location. "You have been thorough, Mr. Holmes," Ashworth said with grudging respect, "but perhaps not thorough enough." He reached into his satchel and withdrew a small glass vial containing a substance that glowed with sickly phosphorescence. The yellow wax contained more than exotic pollen. It carried a slow-acting compound that accumulates in the nervous system. Quinton's death was not from terror alone, but from systematic poisoning. Before anyone could react, Ashworth hurled the vial against the warehouse wall, where it shattered with a sharp crack. The phosphorescent liquid splashed across the bricks, emitting vapors that made the air shimmer with malevolent energy. Holmes, however, remained remarkably composed. "An interesting gambit," he observed, "but one that fails to account for certain precautions. Watson, if you would demonstrate the effectiveness of your medical preparations." To my own surprise, I found myself producing a small atomizer from my medical bag and spraying a fine mist into the air between ourselves and the shattered vial. The phosphorescent vapors immediately neutralized, settling to the ground as harmless powder. "Potassium permanganate solution," Holmes explained to our astonished adversary, "an effective antidote to most phosphorus-based compounds. When one suspects poisoning, it is always wise to consult with chemists who specialize in such matters." As he spoke, Holmes stepped forward and grasped Ashworth's wrist in what appeared to be a restraining gesture. When he released it, a faint luminous glow clung to the man's skin, the barium sulfide marking that would identify him even in complete darkness. The arrival of Lestrade's constables rendered further resistance futile. Both Ashworth and his accomplice were taken into custody, along with their satchels full of forged documents, while the warehouse yielded a treasure trove of evidence, including the printing press, stolen government seals, and samples of the exotic materials that had given the case its supernatural character. "Most illuminating, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade observed as the prisoners were led away, "though I confess the mechanical aspects still perplex me. How exactly did they manage those whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls?" Holmes smiled with satisfaction as he gestured toward a series of nearly invisible openings in the warehouse's exterior wall. "Speaking tubes, Inspector, concealed within the building structure and extending through underground passages to strategic points throughout Marigold Lane. The same Victorian engineering that carries voices through great houses was adapted for psychological warfare. Combined with carefully timed theatrical effects, the yellow wax, the pressed flowers, the humming tops, they created a perfect atmosphere of supernatural menace. As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused to examine the phosphorescent residue with his magnifying glass. "The most dangerous enemies, Watson, are those who understand that fear can be as effective a weapon as any blade." Our Mr. Ashworth combined sophisticated chemistry with psychological manipulation to create the perfect instrument of espionage. The whispers of Marigold Lane had finally been silenced, but their echoes would resonate through the halls of government for years to come. The game, as my friend would say, had reached its most satisfying conclusion. The following morning, our sitting room was transformed into an impromptu tribunal, with the principal actors of our drama assembled to witness Holmes's methodical dissection of the mystery that had terrorized Marigold Lane. Inspector Lestrade occupied his customary position near the hearth, while Elias Vetch, newly released and bearing the wounded dignity of the wrongfully accused, sat with barely concealed curiosity. Mr. Fletcher perched nervously on the edge of his chair, perspiration beading his brow despite the morning chill. Holmes stood before the window, the captured apparatus arranged behind him like trophies of an intellectual hunt. The speaking tubes, chemical samples, forged documents, and that innocent-seeming humming top created a tableau that spoke of ingenuity perverted to criminal ends. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, his keen eyes surveying each face in turn, "you deserve a complete accounting of the deception that has masqueraded as supernatural terror in your quiet lane. Permit me to lay the matter in its proper sequence, for understanding the mechanics will illuminate the motive." He lifted the humming top and set it spinning upon our table, its low drone filling the room with that familiar, unsettling resonance. This simple toy suggested the fundamental principle to our adversaries. Any sustained tone, properly conducted through resonant materials, becomes speech to a frightened ear. The houses of Marigold Lane, with their Georgian construction and shared wall spaces, form a natural acoustic chamber. Moving to the window, Holmes gestured toward the recovered speaking tubes. Colonel Alistair Finch, for that was Ashworth's true name, and his accomplice Heinrich Steiner adapted commonplace Victorian engineering to criminal purposes. They installed a network of narrow-bore tubes throughout the lane's infrastructure, some threaded through abandoned drainage systems, others concealed along cornices and rain pipes, with outlets hidden in keyholes, skirting boards, and most ingeniously, within the central lamppost itself. Lestrade leaned forward with professional interest. "The lamppost, you say?" "Precisely, Inspector. The waxy residue I discovered at its base served to seal and waterproof an acoustic outlet. The lamplighter's borrowed ladder provided access for installation and testing, while the gossamer silk filaments we recovered were not cobwebs, but resin-treated transmission guides designed to stabilize vibration and carry whispered words from the warehouse to their targets." Holmes paused to examine one of the yellow wax samples under his magnifying glass. The exotic materials betrayed our conspirators' true sophistication. This wax contains pollen from Tagetes patula, a marigold variety cultivated in India's hotter regions for its distinctive resin. Such material costs more than Vetch could afford in a year, yet was essential for their dual purpose. "Dual purpose?" Fletcher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Indeed, Mr. Fletcher." The wax served both as theatrical prop and delivery mechanism for a slow-acting phosphorus compound that accumulated in the nervous system. Poor Quinton's death resulted not from terror alone, but from systematic poisoning administered through skin contact with each sealed note. The locked room presented no mystery, once we understood that murder could be accomplished through chemistry rather than physical presence. Vetch's eyes flashed with indignation. "And the evidence against me?" "Planted with audacious precision," Holmes replied. "Steiner, a master forger, found it child's play to imitate your handwriting and create the threatening letter. Your ledger was doctored with entries too perfect, too damning, written in unfamiliar ink that bit deeper into the paper than your genuine records. You were chosen as scapegoat because you were convenient, foreign in appearance, theatrical in profession, and recently at odds with the victim." Holmes moved to the array of forged documents spread across our table. The true motive was espionage on a scale that threatened the security of our eastern territories. Using his legitimate position as a colonial survey officer, Finch had spent years identifying and recruiting compromised clerks throughout the administrative machinery of the empire. The whispers served multiple purposes: extracting specifications for government seals and watermarks, gathering intelligence about security procedures, and creating an atmosphere of supernatural terror that discouraged investigation. The psychological warfare was particularly cunning, Holmes continued, his tone growing more serious. By creating an atmosphere of otherworldly menace, Finch ensured his victims would be reluctant to discuss their experiences with authorities. Who wishes to appear foolish by reporting ghostly voices? Meanwhile, the whispers uncanny. Knowledge, gleaned from careful surveillance and document theft, created an impression of impossible omniscience that reduced grown men to terrified. Compliance. Lestrade shook his head in amazement. But how did you penetrate the deception, Mr. Holmes? The evidence spoke for itself once properly interpreted. The river sand with mica traces found in Quinton's study led me to the Regent's Canal. The lichen species from the warehouse foundation matched specimens caught in the lane's ironwork. The lamplighter's description of a gentleman who smelled faintly of varnish pointed to warehouse operations. Most tellingly, the exotic materials required resources and expertise far beyond those of a simple fraud. Holmes allowed himself a slight smile as he gestured toward the humming top, now wobbling to silence. The irony, gentlemen, is that Finch's very sophistication proved his undoing. A simpler deception might have succeeded indefinitely, but the elaborate apparatus required to create convincing supernatural phenomena left unmistakable traces for those who knew how to interpret them. As our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes stood once more at the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded streets where gas lamps created pools of amber light in the gathering gloom. The most dangerous enemies, he observed quietly, are those who understand that fear can be as effective a weapon as any blade. Our Colonel Finch combined sophisticated chemistry with psychological manipulation to create the perfect instrument of espionage, and very nearly succeeded in compromising the security of an empire. The whispers of Marigold Lane had been silenced, but their echoes would resonate through the corridors of Whitehall for years to come. The game, as my friend would say, had revealed depths of treachery that extended far beyond the narrow confines of a single London street. The wheels of justice turned with characteristic British efficiency in the weeks that followed our confrontation at the Canal Warehouse. Colonel Alistair Finch, stripped of his military honours and facing charges of treason, espionage and murder, maintained his dignified silence, even as the full extent of his network became apparent to the authorities. Heinrich Steiner proved more cooperative, his detailed confessions revealing an operation that had compromised sensitive documents across multiple government departments, necessitating a complete review of security procedures throughout the Colonial Office. Elias Vetch received his official exoneration with a mixture of relief and wounded dignity that was entirely understandable. Before departing London for quieter provincial pursuits, he called upon us at Baker Street to express his gratitude in terms that would have seemed theatrical from any other man, but which carried genuine emotion when delivered in his resonant voice. "Mr. Holmes," he said, clasping my friend's hand with both of his own, "you have restored not merely my freedom, but my faith in the possibility of truth prevailing over convenient prejudice. In my profession, we traffic in comfortable illusions, but your work serves to illuminate rather than obscure reality." The residents of Marigold Lane gradually returned to their customary routines. Though the events had left indelible marks upon the small community, Mrs. Hartwell found herself something of a local celebrity, though she maintained dignified reticence about the more disturbing details of her ordeal. A young Timothy Fletcher had developed an intense fascination with chemistry and acoustics, inspired by Holmes's explanations of the apparatus that had terrorized his neighbors. Mr. Fletcher himself proved most profoundly affected by the revelations. The knowledge that his specialized papers and exotic sealing materials had been used to compromise state secrets weighed heavily upon his conscience, despite his innocence of deliberate wrongdoing. Within a month, he had sold his London establishment and relocated his family to Surrey, seeking escape from whispers of a different sort that now followed him. Through the city's commercial districts, the warehouse by the Regent's Canal was demolished after thorough investigation, revealed the full extent of Finch's acoustic network. The speaking tubes, when completely mapped, showed remarkable ingenuity, extending not only throughout Marigold Lane, but to several adjacent streets, suggesting operations far more extensive than initially suspected. On a grey November evening, as the first snow began to dust the London streets, Holmes and I sat before our familiar hearth. The case files finally closed and filed away. The only sound was the crackle of flames and the distant rumble of the city's ceaseless pulse. I had been attempting to document the affair in my journal, struggling to convey the intellectual satisfaction of witnessing Holmes's methodical demolition of such an elaborate deception. The secret clue. Holmes, I said, setting down my pen. The inconsistency you kept to yourself during those crucial early days, was it truly the lichen specimens? Holmes smiled, reaching for his pipe with characteristic deliberation. Indeed, Watson. The particular species found at the gate between numbers 5 and 6, and later at the warehouse foundations, thrives only on ancient, perpetually damp stone, rarely exposed to sunlight. Its presence in 2 disparate locations, combined with the lamplighters, description of a gentleman who smelled faintly of varnish, common in printing establishments, suggested connections far more complex than simple neighborhood fraud. He rose and moved to his violin case, withdrawing the instrument with reverent care. Such details are often overlooked by those who seek only obvious solutions, but to the properly trained mind, they become signposts leading inexorably toward truth, however convoluted the path. Drawing the bow across the strings, he produced a haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy essence of our recent experiences. The criminal mind, in its most refined form, understands that the greatest deceptions are built upon simple truths, twisted and presented to defy common sense. Finch's whispers were not supernatural voices, but carefully modulated tones designed to exploit human fear and credulity. Yet his very sophistication proved his undoing, I observed. Precisely. The exotic materials, the elaborate apparatus, the psychological precision, all spoke of resources and expertise far beyond those of a simple charlatan. When the parts of a machine are too fine for the craftsman they supposedly belong to, one must seek the master who can afford them. As the violin strains faded into comfortable silence, Holmes returned to his chair with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of a particularly challenging case. Yet something in his manner suggested his extraordinary mind was already turning toward future mysteries, future opportunities to demonstrate that no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand methodical application of logic and observation. Our contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock, followed by her entrance bearing a small envelope sealed with ordinary red wax. "This arrived by special messenger, Mr. Holmes," she announced, marked urgent. Holmes accepted the correspondence with evident interest, breaking the seal to reveal a brief note in Inspector Lestrade's compact handwriting. "Curious burglary at Hatton Garden Jewellers. Nothing taken, everything moved. The proprietor swears he heard whispers. Will you look?" My friend's eyes brightened with that familiar gleam of anticipation as he folded the note and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "Another whisper, Watson," he said with evident satisfaction, though perhaps of an entirely different character. "To new mysteries, then," I said, raising my glass. "To the proper interpretation of them," Holmes replied, and smiled that thin smile of his, already listening for fresh secrets in London's endless undertone. The game, as my friend would say, continued with each dawn.